Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. So this is part 2 of the Manson family cults series, and I might have to record this part in 2 different settings. So if you see me in different clothes, different makeup, different hair, that's why. Because I'm up early and everybody's sleeping, but I expect that somebody will wake up before I'm finished doing this. Now, we left off in part 1 where Manson was finally getting out of prison. After the majority of his life being in some kind of penitentiary or boarding school or boys' school or reform school, Charles Manson was finally free. Now, before he left prison, he met a man who would give him a contact on the outside. This man's name was Phil Kaufman. Phil Kaufman had originally been from New York, but after he got out of the armed forces, he found himself in LA, and he worked as an extra on movies like Spartacus. He also made some connections in the music industry before he was arrested for drug possession, and he was sentenced to 5 to 20 years. After being transferred through a couple different prisons, he did also find himself on Terminal Island. And as soon as he was booked into Terminal Island and he walked into the prison, he heard Charlie playing his guitar, and he liked it. Kaufman thought Charlie was a good singer and a decent guitar player, nothing special, but he liked his singing voice, and he also liked the way he handled the guards. See, the guards would bully Charlie Manson. They'd try to get a reaction out of him. They would make fun of his music and just generally try to taunt him. And Phil heard one of the guards say to Charlie, "You're never getting out of here." And Charlie, who was playing his guitar, stopped playing his guitar, looked up at the guard, said simply, "Get out of where, man?" before he went right back to strumming and singing to himself quietly. This infuriated the guards because no matter what they said to him, he always kept his cool. And he wasn't technically doing anything wrong, so they couldn't get him in trouble for pretending not to know what they were talking about or for being weird. But it pissed them off because they really wanted a reaction. They really wanted him to get upset. They really wanted to see a show, and he wasn't going to give it to them. So Phil thought that Manson was smart and funny. And he thought, he had some musical skill. And he told Manson when he got released to go to his buddy at Universal Studios, Gary Stromberg, and tell him that Phil had sent him. Now, once out on the streets with only his guitar and a feeling of aimlessness, Charlie decided to head north to Berkeley. When he got to Berkeley, he couldn't believe how different things were, how much the world had changed since he'd been on the inside. It was the epicenter for social change and justice. Berkeley, when Manson arrived in 1967, was a heavily politicized school, best known for spearheading the free speech and anti-discrimination movement amongst college-age kids that had started in 1960, when Students for a Democratic Society was formed. Many protests and tug-of-wars between the students, the administration, and the government would follow, but the students of Berkeley stood their ground. Charlie had no idea what was going on. Besides music, he didn't stay up to date on current events. He didn't know what was going on with the Vietnam War. He didn't know who the Black Panthers were, and he didn't know why he seemed to have been released into a world that was really filled with tension, like a time bomb was waiting to go off. He would soon learn all about this new world, though, and find a way to thrive in the chaos. Which is funny because as much as Manson enjoyed the climate, the upheaval, the violence of the times, the little guys pushing back against the man, he didn't really share the beliefs of the time. The free speech, the equality. He was racist, he was sexist, he didn't believe in equal rights for everybody. He believed white men were better than anybody else, and he believed he was better than any other white man. The only cause that Charlie Manson would ever fight for was his own. But he fit in with these revolutionaries anyways. For the first time in his life, he was accepted for the very same things that had made him different in McMecken. His prison time was a signal to these college kids that he had pushed back against the man, that the government was trying to keep him down, and that's what the government did. This generation were the ones who were pushing it back against the societal norms of their parents. Counterculture was cool. It was hip. It was better to be weird and an ex-convict than to be normal. And Berkeley was filled with young men and women who were taking their musical talents to the streets, trying to make it big, just like Charlie. He couldn't make money as a musician in Berkeley because there was 100 other kids trying to do the same thing, and there was too much competition for him. Charlie Manson didn't like competition. He also couldn't make money as a pimp in Berkeley because this was the free love generation. This was the summer of love, 1967. And sex was being given away for free everywhere you turned, so he definitely couldn't charge for it. And of course, he didn't want to work a regular job. He was a talented musician, and working a 9-to-5 would be a complete waste of his skills and talent. So he pretty much needed to find somebody to live off of while he made his dreams come true. And he found her. Her name was Mary Bruner, and she was an assistant librarian. She was a plain-looking 23-year-old from Wisconsin, and she'd moved to California for a little excitement, just like so many other kids had traveled west to find excitement in their lives. And she found that excitement when she met Charles Manson. She was shy, and she dressed very conservatively on a college campus of girls who most likely weren't even wearing bras. And she had failed to make a lot of new friends in her time in California. And Charles Manson had been trained by the best of the best in prison. He was adept at picking out girls who seemed lonely, who didn't have anybody. When he met her on the Berkeley campus, she was walking her dog, and he got her attention by stopping and petting her dog and talking to her about the environment, which was a very important and big cause of Mary's. After that, he played her some songs on his guitar, and he convinced her that he was an earth and animal lover and a musician and pretty much harmless. He also managed to drop into conversation that he was homeless right now. He didn't have any place to stay. Oh, poor me. Well, of course, Mary, being the small-town Wisconsin girl who was lonely and needed friends, wanted companionship, she invited him to stay with her for a little while until he got back on his feet. A few nights turned into Charlie seducing her and basically living with her permanently while she went to work and paid the bills, and he didn't do any of that. He started bringing other girls back to her apartment, which she obviously didn't like at first. She thought that this guy was her boyfriend, and then all of a sudden the other girls started showing up. But he would always be able to make her finally see his way. He made her feel special and pretty when really nobody else ever had in her life. And she eventually just tolerated being one of many, as long as the girls didn't stay around too long, which they never did in the beginning. She always kind of held out hope that he would tire of this constant parade of girls, and one day it would just be the two of them. The parole officer that Charlie had been assigned was across the bridge in San Francisco, and during his regular visits to his parole officer, he took the opportunity to browse the city. He especially enjoyed the neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury, which was hippie central. The summer of 1967 was the summer of love, and children came from all over the country to be a part of the movement which rejected conformity and materialism to live in commune-style communities where everything was shared. There was even a free store and free clinic, and there was a lot of music, drugs, and sex. LSD was the drug of choice. Everyone dressed in clothes they purchased from second-hand shops, flowery dresses and blouses and military attire. The people here were those who had never felt like they fit in where they'd come from, or they didn't ever feel like they belonged anywhere. So no one judged Charlie Manson. They only accepted him with open arms and peace in their hearts. And for Charlie, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. You had new kids getting off the bus in the Haight every day, kids from all walks of life who were eager to be a part of this new culture. They were innocent, naive, and ripe for the picking. There were just as many predators who sought these kids out to take advantage of them, and Charles Manson was one of the worst. These kids were lost, and they'd come to California for guidance on what to do with their lives. They were looking for spiritual guidance because as much as they wanted to be elevated beings, they didn't know how to achieve it. And there was no shortage of street preachers in the Haight. Manson wandered among these street preachers, just kind of listening to what they were saying, picking up little bits and pieces of their ideologies and their preachings and what they believed in. The purpose of him listening was so he could absorb all of this like a sponge. He wanted to copy them because he planned on being a famous rock star. And every famous rock star had followers, groupies, an entourage. He copied and pasted little bits and pieces of their teachings, plus threw some stuff in from Scientology, threw some stuff in from Dale Carnegie, threw some stuff in from the Beatles, and voila! You've got the Charles Manson method. He would stand on street corners or in the park. He would preach to the passerbyers. He would pick up his guitar and play some songs every so often. What made him stand out amongst so many others were his use of dramatics that he learned from Dale Carnegie. He would talk really low, so you'd have to lean in close to hear him. And then all of a sudden he would yell out loud, so you'd have to fly back. He spoke in a musical, sing-songy way, using large hand gestures. He was entertaining, he was charismatic, he could make you feel like he was speaking directly to you while you stood in a crowd of people. He convinced the girls that their inhibition was a societal chain meant to keep them obedient and docile. And they would become intimate with him and have sex with him so that they could prove to him they weren't chained, they weren't docile, they had no inhibitions. And these were the girls that he was bringing back to Mary's apartment still. While she went to work as a librarian every day, he spent his days in the Haight, strumming his guitar and bringing girls back to her apartment. He eventually realized he needed to become more selective with his groupies, and in order to do that, he had to get them each on a one-on-one basis so he could determine whether they were just bent enough but not completely broken. He compared himself to Jesus because he said that's how Jesus had chosen his disciples as well. In May of 1967, on one of his many day trips through California, he ended up in Venice. He was wandering the boardwalk, one of Venice's main attractions where you could encounter anything from mimes to vendors to aspiring musicians. It was a colorful, energetic, and happy environment where he happened upon a young red-headed girl crying on a bench. She would go on to become his most devout follower, never wavering in her belief in him until the very end. Lynette Fromme had a childlike appearance and a soft, high-pitched voice to match. She had been born in Santa Monica, California. She was a good singer and dancer, even appearing on the Lawrence Welk show with a dance troupe called the Westchester Laureates. When her family moved to Redondo Beach, she began to involve herself in drugs and alcohol, and was even rumored to have had an affair with one of her teachers. With a history of emotional problems and a tense and tumultuous relationship with her father, she eventually left home with no plan and no one to look after her. She tells the story of their meeting as she was crying on a bench and Charles Manson approached her, and she thought he was homeless and kind of scruffy at first. But he approached her as she was crying and he said, "Your parents kicked you out, huh?" And from that point, she thought he was a mind reader and had magical powers. He told her that he was called the gardener because he tended all the flower children in the Haight. He sat with her and listened while she unloaded all her fear and anxiety about her life, how she didn't want to be here, she didn't know what she was doing, to which he cryptically responded, "The way out of a room is not through the door. Just don't want out, and then you're free." Which actually makes no sense at all, no matter which way you look at it. But to a young girl like Lynette, he must have seemed incredibly wise and spiritual. He told her the only reason he was in Venice that day was because something had told him he would be needed there, and he thought that he was compelled to go there because of her. He invited her to return with him to the Haight, but Lynette was a little bit on the fence. She was currently enrolled in college and she wanted to finish out the semester, so he told her, "Well, it's your choice, of course," and he began to walk away. I'm sure he recognized that Lynette Fromme was just the right amount of bent without being broken, that he could walk away and she would follow, and she did. He took her home to Mary and he began training her, and eventually the relationship did turn sexual, which most of his relationships with women did. It was her first time, and just like Mary, she had never felt pretty or special before, and Charlie made her feel that way. He looked into her eyes and told her that she was beautiful. Eventually, he brought Mary in on their intimate times, having Mary watch Charlie and Lynette together, having Lynette watch him and Mary together. The girls were led down this path to believe that the relationship they were a part of was normal and healthy and good. And the only reason they might have felt guilty or weird about it was because they had been programmed by society to think that a relationship with a man and woman who were married and were trying to procreate was the only relationship that was acceptable. He would take the girls on long drives where they would run in nature, and Mary and Lynn would strip down and take their clothes off and run around in the woods and pretend to be wood nymphs while Charlie played his flute for them. The three of them eventually took a place in the Haight, where Mary would have to commute to keep going to her job, but Charlie would be right in the epicenter of what his mission and his calling was. And the three of them lived like this for a little while, but eventually Charlie thought it was time to add another girl to the group because his ego really needed that. And Lynette and Mary were pretty much okay with it. I mean, Mary had by this point resigned herself to this life, and Lynette loved Charlie. She loved him completely. She would have done anything he wanted. She thought he was the smartest person in the world and considered him to be godlike. The next addition to the group, at first temporarily and later on permanently, would be Ruth Ann, the daughter of a former congressional minister who picked Charlie up while he was hitchhiking outside of San Francisco and brought him home to meet his family and his daughter. This man's name was Dean Morehouse, and he had enjoyed talking to Charlie on the drive, so he was like, "Hey, you want to come back to my house for dinner? I have a really young daughter I'd like you to meet." And Ruth Ann was an adorable, bubbly, tomboy, sort of energetic type that Charlie just really responded to, and she really liked him as well. But Ruth Ann was only 15 years old. Ugh. And I mean, you gotta think about this, Manson, he's in his 30s at this point. Ruth is 15. The Morehouses had a piano that Charlie took a liking to, and Dean Morehouse, who was incredibly generous with, bringing this hitchhiker to his house and giving him food and letting him into his life and his home, he says, "Yeah, you can have the piano, go for it." He, of course, wasn't going to bring the piano all the way back home. He ended up trading it a couple blocks down the road for a Volkswagen minibus. The bus would give him the opportunity to attract and carry around with him more converts, and he promptly invited Ruth Ann to get on the bus with him and leave, which she did. But her mother was obviously not going to let her underage daughter run away with some old hitchhiker, so she called the police. By the time they tracked them down in Mendocino a few days later, Manson had already talked Ruth Ann into having sex with him a couple times. He had told her he was a traveling minister and that he was the son of man. That's why his name was Manson. Man, son of man. She fell for it hook, line, and sinker. He was arrested and charged with interfering with the questioning of a runaway minor, not with sexual abuse of a minor, not with kidnapping, interfering in the questioning of a suspected runaway juvenile. That's the actual charge. And Ruth Ann was sad to go, but Charlie gave her some advice before she left. He said, "Listen, go home, pick a guy, any guy, doesn't matter, marry him, because once you're married, your parents have no control legally over you anymore. And then I will summon you at some point in the future. When I do, just leave your husband and come back to me. Problem solved." And Ruth Ann did just that. She went home and literally the first guy she could find, she married him, moved out of her parents' house. Sometime later, when Charlie and a much larger group that he'd acquired were hanging out in Topanga for a few days, he would summon Ruth Ann back to him and she would go. The Summer of Love was also the summer of race riots, happening all over the world, but especially California. But none of that was happening in the Haight, where the hippies played the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band on repeat, and used the lyrics as the soundtrack of their life and the movement. The inundation of young people became so problematic, the free resources offered there couldn't keep up with the needs of its population. There were posters put up that said "hippies not welcome" in an effort to curb the growing flower child population, but it didn't discourage them since they were anti-establishment in their beliefs anyways. But these kids were a mess physically. The availability of drugs and sex, a lifestyle of poor diet and hygiene caused a number of ailments in these youngsters. A free clinic was set up that treated hippies with issues such as hepatitis, pneumonia, malnutrition, venereal diseases, skin and gum infections, malnutrition, and complications from botched abortions. Birth control was available then, and Margaret Sanger's birth control pill was approved by the FDA in 1960, but it wasn't easily accessible to unmarried women, and the cost was too high for young girls who didn't have health insurance or jobs. But Charlie, Mary, and Lynn, they weren't worried about race riots. They weren't worried about hippies who weren't taking care of themselves. They weren't worried about the real issues that were going on around them. They were revamping their new minibus. They ripped out the seats and put blankets and pillows down so that you could just relax in the bus. They put drapes up. They drove the bus to Manhattan Beach outside of LA, and this is where they would meet Pat Krenwinkel, a girl who would later find herself on trial for murder for Charlie Manson. She was introduced to Manson by Billy Green, a friend from prison, and when Manson met Pat, she was in a low point in her life. Pat was 19. She was plain, had never been considered attractive by anyone in her life, and had recently gone through witnessing her parents' divorce and then moving with her mother to Alabama. She didn't like the racism that was prevalent in the South and was still emotionally reeling from her parents' divorce, which she claims no one ever wanted to talk about. They always acted like everything was fine and normal, and then one day they just weren't together anymore, and her life was turned upside down. She moved back to California and lived with a drug-addicted older half-sister and her 9-year-old badly behaved son. Manson saw that she was in a state of flux, that she hated her current circumstances, and she was ripe for the picking, so he picked her. He sent Mary and Lynn off somewhere for a few days, and he dedicated his full attention to Pat. He made love to her. He told her she was beautiful. She'd never been told that before. He told her she was special. She'd never been told that before. He lavished her with attention and affection, and after 3 days of this, he asked her to leave with him, come on his bus, and go. Pat asked her friend Billy Green, do you think I should go? I don't know this guy. What do you think about him? And Billy Green basically said, why not? This was the times. Why not? This was the yes culture, not the no culture. Get on the bus and go. Try that drug. Have sex with that guy. Do this, do that. Experiment. Break away from the norms. Break away from your inhibitions that tell you that going off with a strange guy who basically lives on a bus and has other women following him might not be such a good idea. What's the worst that could happen? Much like Mary, who thought that Charles Manson was going to be her boyfriend, Pat was quickly educated as to how life worked as one of Manson's girls. He belonged to no one and everyone. And in a time of free love and pushing against boundaries, who was she to complain about that? The breadcrumbs of attention that Charlie did give each girl was just enough to keep them hanging on because they'd been starved for attention their whole lives, but not too much that they would get used to it, not too much that they would grow accustomed to it or become entitled to it. And they did all seem to get along pretty well. Pat and the other 2 girls, they became friends, and Pat felt like she had gained not only a lover and a spiritual guide, but a group of friends and sisters, which seemed to be an improvement from her previous circumstances. And Charlie loved having Pat around because she was in possession of a credit card that her father had given her, and he couldn't get that credit card away from her quick enough. Next, he wanted to go to Washington State, allegedly to find his mother. Charlie and his 3 girls drove the minibus there, and when he got to his mother's door and she saw who was outside, she told Nancy, her adopted daughter, to run and hide somewhere in the house and not come out until Charlie was gone. Charlie wasn't there to reconnect with his mother. Charlie wasn't there to have a relationship with her, to check on her and see how she was doing, which she was actually doing very well. She had become an excellent mother. She'd eventually left Lewis altogether, and she married a really good man who took care of her and Nancy. She was doing great, but he didn't care about that. He just wanted money from her. When she said she wasn't going to give him any money, he left. He was pissed, and he went back to find the girls who he had left at a friend's house who was a drug dealer and an ex-parole officer of his. And he told them he never ended up finding his mother because he had been rejected by his mother for the first time ever. He had been truly rejected by his mother, and he didn't want to admit that because rejection was something he couldn't handle. Kathleen would never see her son again, which I'm sure she was okay with. By now, I'm sure she figured out that you were only important to Charlie as long as you proved useful to him. She had a child now that she was giving love to, who was giving love to her back. So she knew what a real child-mother relationship and bond could be. And Nancy said when she grew up that she couldn't imagine having a better mother than Kathleen. And she was such a great mom. She was so good to her, and she was basically everything that she could have asked for. They spent some time at this point traveling around in the minibus. They would stay in California, but they did venture out to different states like Arizona, New Mexico. And what would happen on these trips is they would stop someplace, Charlie would start a bonfire, they'd all sit outside and talk, and other nomads and wanderers would be drawn to them by the music, by the fire, by Charlie's dramatic way of speaking, and Charlie would love having an audience. He would gather the other travelers and even the locals around so he could regale them with stories about his life and adventures. But one time, somebody tried to upstage him and told a couple of jokes which made people laugh. This took the attention off of Charlie, which outraged him, and he threw his styrofoam cup of wine at this guy. And this is a common theme with these cult leaders. The need for all eyes to be on them at all time. They need to be the most important person in the room. They need to be the smartest person in the room, or at least people need to perceive them as that. He also liked to play a fun knife game with Mary and Lynn while they were on their travels, where he would make them stand against a tree and then throw knives at their head. Never actually hitting their heads, always the tree above their heads, but it freaked the girls out. He explained it to them as a trust exercise. If I throw a knife at your face and you flinch, you don't trust me. But if I throw a knife at your face and you don't flinch, that must mean you trust me, which is insane because I don't know anybody who can literally stand there and have a knife thrown at their face without flinching. It's a natural reaction. These aren't trust falls here. You're throwing sharp objects at my head. Why wouldn't I flinch? The girls soon learned that to keep Charlie in a good mood, so that he wasn't hitting them or yelling at them or just grumpy in general, which means he wanted everybody else to be grumpy, they had to stay enraptured by his every word. Every time he was talking, they had to be watching him. If there was other men around, they could not look at these other men. They could not appear to be interested in these other men. If he thought they were paying too much attention to another man, he would grab them by the hair and slap them or hit them in the face. The only time they were allowed to look at another man is when he loaned them out to other men, which he often did. But when he did that, he was getting something in return, whether it be monetary or something of barter or connections to somebody else who was important. He would use these girls as a currency. He hadn't visited Phil Kaufman's friend, Gary Stromberg, at Universal yet, but he was planning on it. He was working really hard on getting all his songs polished up and ready to play for Gary. He planned on returning to LA soon to be discovered, but when he did, he wanted to make sure he arrived in style, suitable to a rock star of his caliber. He needed an entourage, but the 3 girls he had with them, they weren't gonna cut it. He mainly tried to use the 3 girls, Mary, Lynn, and Pat, as a draw for the men, mainly to get other converts to the group. So they would go out and they would talk to other girls, and the girls would want to come back and be with the group because it was other girls who they felt safe with who were bringing them back. And the men would want to come back and be with the group because they were offering them free sex. So he used the girls as a draw, a way to bring more followers. But he didn't think much of their physical appearance. no matter how many times he told them that they were beautiful or special, he didn't actually think they were. And he was trying to get some really choice male converts because women were stupid. They weren't his equals. He couldn't have conversations with them. He wanted some men in the group who were smart, but not as smart as him, who were handsome, but probably not as handsome as him, and who also would do everything he wanted without questioning him. But how was he going to bring in these choice male specimens with the kind of plain bait that he was trying to catch him with? What he needed was an attractive girl who was already promiscuous, so he didn't have to train her, and he could get started within a couple of days just pulling in these choice male converts. Enter 20-year-old Susan Atkins. She had been 15 when her mother died of cancer, and she was turned into the mother figure for her younger brother, while her father tried and failed to keep steady employment. She had behavior problems, depended on drugs and alcohol to make her feel better, and wasn't shy to sleep with anyone who showed interest. Another attention-hungry lost soul who left home as soon as she could and moved to San Francisco for a new life. She had been arrested in Oregon in the fall of 1966 when she was caught robbing a gas station in a stolen car. She was given 2 years of probation and worked as a topless dancer in the Haight, where her pleasant looks and overt sexuality attracted the attention of Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. He hired her to be in his new show that included topless female vampire dancers, and she couldn't have been more pleased to be given a job that allowed her to gather admirers and attention. She had to stop working in the show when her health began failing from excessive drug use and a wicked case of gonorrhea. That is when she began a life of an aimless drug addict. She met Charles Manson at the apartment of a friend while he was entertaining everyone with his rendition of The Shadow of Your Smile, a popular love ballad at that time that Tony Bennett would eventually cover. Susan was blown away by his skill on the guitar, which was ironic because he wasn't that good. And she couldn't stop herself from staring at him with hearts in her eyes, which his large ego couldn't help but allow him to notice. He was really good at telling what other people wanted and what they liked and what they were into without even talking to them. And he could tell she was into music. So he told her, you can pick up my guitar and play it if you want. She then vowed to follow him anywhere. I'm not sure why. She was attracted to him. She thought he was talented. He was enigmatic. She also felt he was godlike. But she became his fourth follower and the bait he would use to sexually appeal to men. Next, they all went to Sacramento, where they met up with Pete, another prison buddy of Charlie's. Pete owned a couple of brothels, and Charlie said, "Hey, let my girls work in your brothels for a day. I want to see how they like it." I think it was a way for him at this point to gauge how much control he had over them. What would they say no to? How far would they go? But none of them said no. They worked in this guy's brothels for the day. And then in the future, whenever they were running low on money or maybe they were acting up, Manson told the girls he was going to send them to Pete's brothels. Mary then became pregnant with Charlie's child, and she thought, still naively for some reason, she thought this was exactly what he would need to make him be exclusive to her or value her above all the rest. Manson was thrilled about the pregnancy. He said that babies were spiritually pure and his child would serve as a model for everybody in his family to strive to be like. Many other girls in the group would get pregnant in the months following, but this was when Charlie was loaning them out to many different men, and he never let them use birth control. He said it wasn't natural, so they could have been Charlie's kids or they could have been the kids of any other man that these girls had been with. But now they would need a bigger ride, and the VW minibus was replaced with a big yellow school bus that they once again ripped the seats out of and put curtains on the windows, tried to make it more comfortable, and they painted it all black. On the side of the bus, the words Hollywood Productions was written. There really wasn't much of a purpose to writing Hollywood Productions on the side of the bus besides to confuse people, and I think that Charlie almost felt like it gave him a feeling of importance when he was driving around in this bus. Like people would see it driving and be like, "Oh, Hollywood Productions, who's that? Is it a movie star? Is it a movie crew? What's going on?" They would wonder about who was driving the bus, and he was in the bus and he knew they were wondering about it. So it gave him some sort of ego boost. And whenever they weren't traveling, Charlie was sending them out to recruit people. Women, yes, he loved women and he saw that they had a purpose that he could use them for, but he needed some male brains on board. Women weren't his equals, especially intellectually. He couldn't talk to these girls. He needed some males on board the bus, the black school bus. A couple of guys that had joined up with the group ended up leaving during an extended road trip because they said the vibes on the bus were just way too creepy and strange. It annoyed Manson, but a few days later, the girls found Bruce Davis. Bruce Davis loved the way Manson had girls around him all the time, and he wanted that too. He wanted to be Manson's second in command and be able to order the girls around and get them to do whatever he wanted. Bruce was a Southern boy from Louisiana, and he'd been the editor of his high school paper. And now his main goal was being the right-hand man of a pseudo-spiritual leader who had the ability to dominate and order around a couple young women. High aspirations, Bruce. High aspirations. Now, this road trip also included, for some reason, a visit to the Morehouse residence, Dean Morehouse, the man who had invited Charlie into his home, and Charlie had left with his 15-year-old daughter, Ruth Ann. I don't know what Charlie was thinking, but he wanted to show Dean how his gift of the piano had turned into a minibus and now the school bus. He wanted to show him how he had achieved these things from the gift of the piano. And Dean Morehouse was obviously not happy to see him. His daughter had left and married the man that Manson told her to marry. And his wife had left him as well because she blamed him for bringing the person into their home who had eventually led to the loss of their daughter. He told Manson that he wasn't welcome at his home and he sent them away. But after they left, he sat there and he got more and more upset. And eventually, after a few minutes, he grabbed his shotgun and he went after them to find them, which wasn't hard considering it was the only black school bus with Hollywood Productions on the side in town. When Dean Morehouse put the shotgun to Charlie Manson's head, everybody on the bus was terrified. Charlie had always preached to them that life was the same as death. None of it really mattered. But it was a different story when you were standing there with a gun pressed to your head and an angry father about to pull the trigger. In Manson fashion, something he learned in prison, when the guards would try to provoke him, he remained calm, and he simply smiled and said, "Go ahead, shoot me." Dean Morehouse, who was irate off of the rails and literally seeing red, he was taken aback by this. It stopped him in his tracks. Even as Charlie put his hand on Morehouse's shoulder and talked to him about love being better than hate and anger, Morehouse didn't end up shooting him. He put the gun down, he tripped on acid with the group, and wished them well before he left. Charlie's followers were more in awe now than they ever were. He had been held at gunpoint. He was staring down the barrel of a gun, about to have his life come to an end, and he'd never lost his cool. And he had talked a man down who was 1 minute completely outraged and the next completely fine. No human could have done that. He was superhuman. He was like a god. And yes, I agree. Having a gun pointed at your head and telling the person who's holding the gun to shoot you is not normal. I think any person who can do that is probably legitimately crazy. In the fall of 1967, Manson and his family would leave San Francisco for Los Angeles, where Manson hoped to audition for Gary Stromberg and become famous. San Francisco would only get a couple of years reprieve before having another madman and his cult move in 1970, when Jim Jones and his People's Temple settled in the city. Now, Los Angeles is known for a lot of things. The Hollywood sign, the Hollywood Walk of Fame, celebrities, getting frozen yogurt and Starbucks on every corner, and they are also known for an incredibly corrupt police force. At this time in LA, the LAPD wasn't much better than it was in the time of the Black Dahlia, or for that matter, than it is today. The LAPD has a history of police issues and misconduct. And even though at this time the population of Los Angeles was racially diverse, its police force was mainly made up of white men who had been to the military, white men who were high school educated, white men who were mainly from the South. It seemed like the city didn't want anyone on that police force that would be sympathetic to the civil rights movement of the time. They were actually taught that Black activists like Martin Luther King Jr. were trained and funded by the Communist Party. It was the police force's job to prevent this anarchy from taking over their city. They were given permission to be physical with anyone who gave them problems, and if a police officer was brought up on charges of excessive force, he was defended blindly and tirelessly by the city of Los Angeles. They were not going to let anyone get away with their crime, not in their city, unless the criminal was Hollywood elite, a movie star, a singer, a son of a movie star or singer, writers, producers, sons and daughters of writers and producers, anybody who was in the entertainment industry, who had money and lived in the right places in town, they were pretty much exempt from getting in trouble for committing crimes, and so were basically their entire families. Police officers were expected to recognize these people and their families by sight so that they would know to let them get away with certain things. And when I say certain things, I mean pretty much everything except murder. And I'm not writing off the possibility that some of these people got away with murder. I'm not writing off that possibility. Teenage Terry Melcher was one of the entitled who was given the good old sweep it under the rug treatment. He was the son of famous actress Doris Day, and he would one day become notable in his own right soon enough. One night, he was driving his car with 3 of his friends. In the passenger seat was Dean Martin Jr., in the back, Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, and Greg Jacobson. And you know, boys will be boys. They pulled over, they took out a handgun, and Dean Martin Jr. and Terry Melcher got out of the car and they started shooting at streetlights. Dennis Wilson and Greg Jacobson, who were still in the car, they came from a blue-collar background. They hadn't really been rich and famous for long enough to understand that there was certain exceptions if you were part of that group. So they were kind of terrified, especially when the police lights came up and the police cars pulled up. They thought they were going to get arrested. They were going to get in trouble. But they were surprised when their friends Terry and Dean, standing outside the car, pretty much just laughed and waved as the police cars pulled up. And one of the police officers got out of the car and took away Terry Melcher's gun, but told him, you know, Mr. Melcher, you can come down to the station and grab this anytime. Have a good night. Get home safe. Terry and Dean allegedly laughed as the cops drove off, and their friends in the car realized that there was a different set of rules. If you had the right skin color, if you had the right parentage, if you had the right amount of money and power and influence. August 11th, 1965 was the evening that Black teenager Marquette Fry was being arrested by 2 LAPD cops when a riot broke out, the Watts riot. It lasted 6 days, brought 34 fatalities, 1,000 injuries, 4,000 arrests, and $40,000 in property damage. The riot only ended when the rioters ran out of energy, and the Watts area of LA was completely destroyed. This caused paranoia amongst the white population of LA. It was fueled by Police Chief William Parker, who warned them that by 1970, 45% of the LA population would be Black, and the next neighborhood that was leveled by a race riot could be theirs. They would need to support a strong police force if they wanted protection from these violent offenders. Blacks all over LA at this time would be scrutinized by local law enforcement and the general public equally. They would always be looking at them like, what are you doing here? What kind of trouble are you up to? Because the police and the politicians in the city at this time were basically trying to scare the crap out of the rich white people so that they would pay the police department and support the police department so that they could be protected from this potential population growth of Blacks that would overrun the white population, and you had to be terrified of this. The importance of the racial tensions in LA and the entire country at this time is important, because Charles Manson would use this unrest later as a motive for murder. Charlie was excited to get to LA and claim his fame, and he told his group that was following him they needed to be impressive to these record producers and these big important types he would be hanging out with. And they were confused. They were like, why do you care about being famous and rich? He was like, no, I don't care about being famous and rich. My songs are so impactful so important. The world needs them. That's why I have to impress these people who will get my songs out there. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to, like be taken out to dinner and paid millions of dollars so that we can do what's best for the world. And Gary Stromberg at Universal Studios, he met with Manson right away. Phil Kaufman didn't often recommend a lot of people to Stromberg, so he figured the least he could do was meet with the guy and let him audition and listen to his music. Charlie showed up bathed and in clean clothes, but barefoot, with 4 girls in tow. Manson played for Gary in the office, and Gary liked what he heard, so he arranged a studio session. He wanted to see how Manson's sound would translate onto a record. Even though he liked Manson's style and liked his music, he thought it was weird how the entire time that they were all there together in the same room, all 4 girls never took their eyes off of Charles Manson. The session was a train wreck. He'd never been in a studio before. All the mics and the equipment and people telling him what to do and where to stand and what to do with his voice, he lost it. He had a meltdown. He did not like it. Stromberg carefully and tactfully told him that he should work on his song some more and maybe in the future they could work together again. And this was a polite but casual brush off. He didn't plan on working with him in the future. However, he wondered if Manson could stay in town for a couple of days because he did have a project that the studio was working on. Universal had been throwing around an idea of a movie where Christ returned to modern times, and Gary thought that it would be pretty cool if Manson could hang around and discuss scripture with him and give him his interpretation of the Bible because he thought he had some pretty interesting ideas about the Bible. Gary Stromberg brought Manson and his girls out to lunch a couple of times while they talked, and this was where Charlie illustrated to Gary Stromberg that the Bible says women should be submissive to men, so he would order his girls to get down on their knees and kiss his feet. He then got down on his hands and knees and kissed their feet, because he wanted to show that although women should be submissive, when they behave properly, they should also be rewarded. Stromberg watched as Charlie preached on the beach about the sins of materialism, and he was called out by a guy who was walking by. And the guy said, "If you don't have a connection to physical things, what do you have that school bus for?" And Charlie, not fazed, didn't miss a beat. He tossed him the keys and he said, "Here, it's yours, take it, I don't need it." And the guy took the keys and got in the bus and drove away, which left them busless. They had no transportation now. If Manson was surprised that the guy took the keys and drove away, he didn't show it. And eventually the bus was returned, which left both the girls and Gary Stromberg pretty impressed at how cool Manson was and collected, and maybe he really did mean the things he said. The Modern Day Jesus project got shut down, and Stromberg wasn't pursuing Charlie to get him back into the studio at this point. But Charlie wasn't deterred. He was in LA now, the place where dreams came true, and his eventually would, one way or the other. He and the girls began crashing at the spiral staircase in Topanga Canyon, located in the Santa Monica Mountains. The house was given its name for the spiral staircase located on the outside, which was the only way to access the upper floor, and the staircase would bring you into one of 2 living rooms. It was nestled in Lower Topanga in an area known as the Snake Pit because of its population of rattlesnakes, but also because of its population of unsavory characters that liked to make their home there. Bobby Bosley was also a sometimes temporary resident of the spiral staircase at this time, and every time I see the name Bobby Bosley, or I have to say it, I think of Bobby Boucher from The Waterboy, so tell me you don't. Like Manson, Bosley always had a harem of girls around him, but unlike Manson, the girls flocked to Bobby because he was attractive. They were attracted to him. They weren't scared into submission. Charlie figured that Bobby would be a good addition to his family because he could attract the kind of high-caliber, pretty girls that Charlie really wanted around him. And the two had a lot in common, actually, mostly their overblown egos. And Bobby Bosley was good-looking, and he bragged about his musical talent, and he was known to have some connections in the music industry, but Bobby wasn't a follower. He thought much too highly of himself for that. He did agree to hang out with Manson for a little bit. They even formed a little band called the Milky Way, which did a couple performances in the Topanga Canyon area. But like most young people in this time period, Bobby wasn't interested in staying put for any extended period of time. He did, however, introduce Manson and his girls to Geary Hinman, a music teacher and a drug dealer with a mescaline factory in his basement and who lived nearby. Geary rented a really nice house at 964 Old Topanga Canyon Road, and he generously allowed strangers and new friends to stay with him sometimes and even borrow his cars. But if Manson's time at the spiral staircase taught him anything, it was that he and his girls, they couldn't stay in any one place too long. He hated competition, and places like the spiral staircase were filled with competition. Young men and women coming in all the time, most of them musically talented, most of them preaching an ideology of their own. He couldn't have one of these men who was more attractive, more enlightened, and might offer his girls a better deal, coming in and swooping any one of them away from him. So he packed everybody back into the bus. He brought them to the Mojave Desert, where he preached to them about obedience and minimalism and played the Beatles music for them in the most isolated place that he could find. By the time they headed back to LA, Susan Atkins was pregnant, most likely from one of the many men that Charlie had pawned her off on while they were on their travels. Charlie was happy about it. Mary was going to be giving birth soon, and once Susan's baby arrived, they would all share the responsibilities of parenting, commune style. Like the Hog Farm, a popular commune in LA run by a man who called himself Wavy Gravy. Manson and the girls stayed here for a couple of days, and that's when they met 14-year-old Diane Lake. Now, Diane was interested in the school bus and their adventures, and Lynn and Pat invited her to come along with them. Diane asked permission from her parents, who apparently didn't think it was a bad idea for her to get on a bus with a bunch of weird hippie strangers and drive off to who knows where, and they gave their permission for her to go. Now, Diane Lake, I believe it was in 2017, she wrote her own sort of memoir autobiography of her time with the Manson family, and it's called A Member of the Family. And I've had a chance to skim through it, but I have not had a chance to read all of it. I wish I had that opportunity because it seems really, really good. But Manson dangled Diane in front of the other girls. He told them that she was what they should aspire to be. She was a pure soul. She hadn't been shaped or ruined by society yet because she was so young. She also became his favorite sexual partner, which is just disgusting. And although he still spread his love out amongst the girls because he had to prove that everybody was equal, she was clearly his favorite for a while. He also spread his wrath among the girls, who would often be seen with bruises and black eyes. Now, in her book, A Member of the Family, Diane Lake said that Charlie had this ability to make sense out of nonsense. I have this memory of being on acid and standing in front of a mirror with him. He was showing me how many different people he could become, just by moving his facial muscles and smiling a certain way, shifting his hair or wearing a different hat. He was a chameleon, and he could find people's weaknesses that way. He preyed on them, and he wanted to teach us how to do it too. Now, I have my own opinions about many of the followers of Manson. I have my own opinions about who I think was just a confused kid wrapped up in nonsense, who was actually a psychopath and a bad person in their own right, and at the end kind of just blamed Manson. Not that he wasn't to blame. He, of course, was to blame. He should hold a great deal of the blame. But many of his followers were, I believe, bad and evil people in their own rights. Diane Lake was not one of them. She was a 14-year-old girl who had been living in a commune where she'd already been exposed to sexual activity and drug activity. And it's clear how little she was cared about when you consider the fact that her parents allowed their 14-year-old daughter to go off with a 30-something-year-old man surrounded by women who he was clearly using and abusing. Diane also, in hindsight, says she realizes that the warning signs were pretty obvious, that Charlie and his girls were gushing over her. And when somebody's gushing over you and fawning over you too intensely, that's a sign that something's not right. But she said meeting Charlie and his girls was like magic. And that's how these groups will draw in and manipulate emotionally vulnerable young people. And when I say young people, I don't mean 18, 19, I mean 13, 14. She was very young. The group wandered around. Like I said, Charlie wasn't interested in settling in one place where there would be outside influences for very long, which is how they eventually ended up at Spawn Ranch. But sometimes they would stay with Geary Hinman in Topanga Canyon. Sometimes they would stay at the Spiral Staircase. He continued to return to Topanga because he still had hopes that he would be recognized and discovered for his musical abilities. And there was a lot of music types who lived and partied in Topanga Canyon. This was the 1960s, and it was, all free love. Everybody's equal. So a lot of these musical types, even well-established musicians, were picking more down-to-earth places to live, more close to the wilderness places. And Topanga Canyon was quite wild at this time. So they would get nice houses there, but they felt like they were living amongst the people. They didn't have gates at their houses. They didn't have alarms or security guards. Even since the 1920s, Topanga Canyon had always been a sort of getaway from the city for movie stars and the Hollywood elite who would have cottages there. And in the 1960s, you had artists like Dennis Wilson, who lived in Topanga Canyon. Neil Young lived in Topanga Canyon. In fact, he recorded most of his Gold Rush album there. Their houses were typically open to strangers who would just show up with their guitar and a song and hope to impress the musician enough to be recommended to his label. Frank Zappa recalled that he would just wake up in the morning and go downstairs to get coffee, and there would be people sitting in his living room just waiting for him to wake up so they could play their music for him and party with him and hopefully, impress him. So it was a strange time. It definitely, when people say that Manson and his family put an end to the 60s, this is kind of what they're talking about. This freedom, this feeling like everybody was the same and nobody would hurt you and everybody loved you, even if you were a big star. Maybe you knew people were using you, but you didn't think they would mean you any harm. And everybody had such a bohemian sort of lifestyle going on where you just lived together and worked together and you tried to help each other, which is great to some extent. And I wish that the world could be more like that. However, there are really bad people who not only want to use you, but do intend you harm. And I do think that a lot of these artists opened themselves up to what ended up happening, especially later with Charlie Manson and the Beach Boys. There comes a point when you're famous enough or you have enough money where you need to protect yourself from not the average person, but the crazy person. And Charles Manson proved this. He was aggressive and pushy with these people, and most of them disengaged themselves. And they were like, okay, this is too much. We're all here smoking weed, trying to be chill, and this guy's going too hard. When potential converts were brought back to Charlie, he would want to test them individually to see if they had what it took to be a permanent member of the group. Even if they didn't have what it took to last in the group, Charlie would basically suck everything they had to give before he was like, this isn't gonna work out. So basically, if they had money, if they had a car, if they had a place to stay, if they had anything that he wanted or needed, he would use them for that until they didn't have it anymore. And then he would say, you know what, you're really not a good fit for our group, so we're gonna have to ask you to leave. Men were more his intellectual equal than women could ever be. They still weren't equal to him because they weren't, the son of man, but they at least could carry on a conversation. One of these men was Paul Watkins. Paul had a pretty standard middle-class American upbringing. He was part of a Christian family and they moved around a lot. He spent some time in Lebanon when he was an infant, and after 4 years there, where his father worked on a pipeline, the family moved to Beaumont, Texas, and then to Thousand Oaks, California. When he was a child and a young adolescent, he enjoyed attending church and hiking in the oak groves near his home. He was a Bible student and he was active in his youth organizations and church camps. But when he entered high school, his musical interests had overtaken his religious interests, and his passion had become music and singing. Paul was one of those kids that he was a really good kid. He was student body president every single year until 11th grade, when he became more involved in LSD and marijuana and music than he was in school. And he was removed from the school when his use of psychedelic drugs kind of interrupted the learning process. He called himself a fugitive flower child in search of enlightenment and truth. And he was hit hard by the Vietnam War when 2 of his friends were sent home from the war in body bags. Paul aspired to be Manson's second in command, but Bruce Davis was already vying for that position. So Manson managed to convince both men that they were both his right-hand man. Manson would send Bruce Davis on scouting missions to basically live with other cults or other groups and see how they functioned, such as sending him to London to work for the Church of Scientology headquarters from November of 1968 to April of 1969. But Paul Watkins, he kept at his side in order to disarm women that he wanted to join the group, because sometimes these women would be a little put off by Charlie's intensity. Watkins had a baby face and a boyish charm. He had this long, dark, tousled hair and these wide, dark eyes. And when these girls were brought to Charlie, he literally had counseling sessions with them. He would get so deep into their lives and their pasts until he figured out what their Achilles heel was. What was the thing they were most scared of? What was the thing they were most insecure about? What could he use and prey on in order to make sure that they would follow him to the ends of the earth? He convinced these girls that they'd been abused by authority figures all their life, but no one would ever love them more than he would. In fact, Charlie would continue to abuse them one way or the other. One of his temporary followers, who was not broke enough to actually join but was rich enough to use, was Didi Lansbury, daughter of Angela Lansbury from Murder, She Wrote. Didi was a beautiful girl, and she was still in high school. Every day they would pick her up from high school, and she would buy Charlie whatever he wanted, whatever he needed with her credit cards. Eventually, her parents caught on and the money stopped, but Charlie's experience with Didi taught him that the children of the rich and famous were great targets. If not for permanent members, then at least for an income source, because they didn't really want to rebel. They didn't really feel like society had done them wrong, because it hadn't, but they wanted to try rebelling. They wanted to try their hand at what was new and fresh and in and all the other young kids were doing. They weren't going to stay. They weren't going to run off with him and let him abuse them and trade them off to other men. But they were going to, give a little quick walk on the wild side and see how they liked it and then go back home to their big house and their money. Like Heaven's Gate, Charlie encouraged his followers to take separate names, new names other than their given name. This way they could separate themselves from their old lives, the societal oppression they'd been under, their birth parents who would never do anything good for them. Susan Atkins was known as Sexy Sadie. Lynette Fromme became Squeaky. Patricia Krenwinkel had a bunch: Big Patty, Yellow, Marnie, but she was most often known as Kate. Diane Lake was given the nickname Snake because she was doing a cleanse with the other girls that was like lemon and honey and water, and she claims it gave her a natural high, and she was rolling on her belly in the grass, and the other girls were like, oh, you look like a snake, so they called her Snake, and then Charlie heard it and he liked it, so it stuck. I guess it's better than being called Squeaky, though. Charlie was still called Charlie, though, and if they called him anything else, it was Jesus Christ. Their money was spent to make sure the group had enough LSD and marijuana to keep them sufficiently out of it the majority of the time. And for food, they went dumpster diving, basically. They would go behind restaurants and figure out when they were going to be throwing their old stuff out and just grab it out of the dumpster. The girls were also known to trade sex for some fresher food from the grocery store, and they even masqueraded as Girl Scout leaders and went into markets and asked for donations. When Phil Kaufman was released from Terminal Island in March of 1968, he looked for Charlie and found him in Topanga. Kaufman was surprised and pleased to see that the awkward, scrawny songbird he'd known in prison was now surrounded by a harem of sexually open women who were more than happy to extend their courtesy and generosity to any friend of Charlie's. After being locked away in prison for so long, he eagerly took anything they had to give, including STDs, I'm sure. Manson told him that a big problem in society was the fast rate that the blacks were reproducing. And in order to counteract this threat, they needed white guys like him and Phil to get as many girls as possible pregnant so that they could keep the scales balanced. I don't know if he thought that him and like 5 or 6 girls were gonna populate the world, but Charlie also let him know that his meeting with Stromberg hadn't really gone as planned. He wanted to know if Kaufman had any other connections or musical friends that he could, send his way. And Kaufman, who's now out of prison, he wanted to get back into the entertainment industry. He would keep living with Charlie while he got on his feet and got his, head back in the game. And then when he found somebody or he had an in, he would make sure that he brought Charlie along with him. The group's days were pretty much all the same. They woke up late because they'd been up all night doing drugs and having orgies, and the girls would get something ready for breakfast while the men repaired things, most usually cars, vehicles, or bikes that Charlie had found or been given that needed to be fixed. The weird thing was, as soon as these cars or bikes were in mint working condition after they'd all worked on them tirelessly, Charlie would sell it or just give it away, and they would get upset because they'd put their hard work, their blood, sweat, and tears into fixing these vehicles, and then Charlie would just give them away. And Charlie was like, no, this is a lesson for you guys in materialism and being too connected to physical things. I'm doing this for your own good. Really, I think that he just wanted projects to keep everybody busy during the day so they wouldn't get too bored, idle hands. They wouldn't start thinking too much about what are we doing here and is this what life is? He didn't allow them to have watches or calendars. He didn't want them to ever know what day it was, what time it was. He said time was a fake thing made up by society. Somebody just one day said, this is what time it is, and everybody went along with it. So it didn't really matter. It wasn't important. It wasn't relevant. Really, I think he just wanted to keep them disoriented and distracted. And wherever they were living, Charlie made sure there was a time and place for sex and drugs. There would always be a room set aside for the group's sex, and Charlie would be there giving out commands of who should be with who and how they should be with that person, just basically directing it like some weird porno director. Since the women always outnumbered the men, though, these sessions would consist of the women taking care of the men and not getting much back in return, if you know what I mean. They didn't dare complain about this ever, though, because according to Manson, it was the woman's job and top priority to make sure the men were taken care of and happy, and anything else that they got after that would just be gravy. Wavy gravy. And Charlie would always be the one to dole out the doses of LSD to his followers, always making sure to take a smaller dose himself. His followers would marvel at the way that he always seemed to be in control, even when everybody else was tripping out of their minds. And he did that purposely. He wanted people to think that he couldn't be touched by things like drugs and alcohol or illness. He was above that. Dinners were cooked by the women, of course, family style, and afterwards they would have some entertainment, which was Charlie, usually, always, singing his songs or Beatles songs, and sometimes the girls would pop in and sing backup. And then after that, they'd probably go out for the night, see if there was a party around, just wander around, see where everybody was at, what was happening, where was the scene. Kaufman knew some people around town, and he would sometimes take Charlie and his girls with him when he popped in for visits. One old friend was Harold True, who rented a house in Los Feliz on Waverly Drive. Manson saw that the area where Harold rented was pretty nice, not millionaire status, but they seemed wealthy and well off. Harold ended up moving out of the neighborhood a couple of months later, but sometime after that, another couple moved onto Waverly Drive, next door to the house where Harold had rented. Their names were Lino and Rosemary LaBianca. After about 5 weeks, Phil Kaufman left the group. He hadn't proved useful to Charlie as far as getting him connections, and he had begun to question Charlie. And Charlie could not have anyone questioning him, especially in front of his group. He could not have that. So he and Phil split ways, and it wasn't a bad parting. They weren't mad at each other. They still kept in touch. Phil wasn't the kind of person who's going to be manipulated or fall for Charlie's tricks, and Charlie knew that. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, and a wave of race riots broke out across the nation. While all of this was going on in the world, Manson was telling his followers that they were lucky to be avoiding it all, keeping to themselves, and living in a drug-induced haze. Just like Jim Jones, when he would preach to his followers of how bad it was in the world, how there were people out there who would hurt them, and that they were lucky to be safe with him. The less they knew about what was actually going on out there, the better. They just needed to know he was bad, but he wouldn't let that touch them. That same month, he met Sandy Good. Sandy was a young girl who had experienced health issues in childhood, even having to have one of her lungs partially removed, leaving her throat and her torso scarred. Because of their guilt over her health problems and their divorce when she was 4, Sandy's parents spoiled her. In the spring of '68, she was on a quest to find herself, and she visited LA to see a friend there, and that's when she met Charles Manson. The relationship between Sandy and Charles Manson was perfect and symbiotic for him. He offered her a family who would always love her, and she offered him a trust fund. She was getting $200 a month from her stockbroker father that she happily signed over to Charlie. Sandy is an interesting person, and in the last part, we're going to do a little bit more talking about where they are today, but she was pretty much a die-hard follower of Manson's until the very, very end. And she was a little different than the other girls at that point, too. She wore makeup and jewelry, she took care of herself a little bit more. She came from like a sort of upper class family who had money, and she was even described as being snobby by people who knew her. Charlie spent a lot more time working with her to brainwash her, to completely desecrate the person she'd been before to the person he wanted her to be now. And I think that might have something to do with how she turned out and how she became this person that even in her 50s and 60s was defending him. The reason he focused so much time on her, though, was because the girls didn't really like her when she came in. She was kind of stuck up. And he wanted her to stay because he wanted that money that she was getting every month from her father. So he told the girls, you have to be nice to her. And he made Sandy take her clothes off in front of them and showed them the scars on her and said, look what her birth parents have done to her. Nobody's loved her. Nobody's taken care of her. It's our job to take care of her. Look at what she's been through in her life. Of course, she's got some other things to overcome and maybe things that make her different than you, but we need to still accept her and love her. Not because he wanted her to be accepted and loved, but because he wanted her money. Another person that Charles met in April was his son, Valentine Michael Manson, named after his favorite character from his favorite book, Stranger in a Strange Land. The baby was born on April 15th, and although Mary wanted to go to a hospital and be treated by actual, medical professionals, Manson insisted that that was not how they did things. This was going to be done the natural way, at home, with the help of the other girls to deliver the baby. Even though the other girls told them, we don't have any idea how to deliver a baby. We don't know what we're doing. He said, you're women. It's innate in you. You'll figure it out. The baby was breached, and after a lot of pain and suffering on Mary's part, somehow the girls managed to fumble their way through this delivery, and miraculously, both the mother and the baby were born healthy, and he was given the nickname of Pooh Bear, or just Pooh for short. Although Pooh Bear and the other children who would eventually be born into the family and live with the family were well taken care of, Charlie himself had very limited patience for children. He would talk in reverence about the pure soul of a child, about how they would save us all. They are who we should strive to be like, this untainted being. But if they cried too much or too long, it would drive him absolutely nuts and he would be furious. So it became the general practice to keep all children away from Charlie at all times. They were usually isolated to a separate room as far away from where Charlie was as possible and put into the care of whoever Charlie decided would be the daycare provider for them. He didn't want their birth parents around them. He thought that that was an unhealthy connection and relationship to somebody, and it would distract his followers from placing him above all else. If they have a child, and that child becomes the most important thing to this person, they may second guess what they're doing with Manson. They may realize what actual love is, and it wasn't what they felt for Charlie. It was what they now felt for their child. So he made a huge effort to keep the birth mothers away from their babies, which I think is just awful. He would assign them to different parents. And this is also what Jim Jones did when his followers arrived in Guyana. If they were with their families or they were with a spouse, he would separate them and make sure that they didn't have any connection so that they felt isolated and they felt like the most important person in the world was Jim Jones. And Manson kept sending the girls out, but this time he wasn't interested in them going out to get new followers. He was interested in them going out and finding important people in the record industry, in the music industry, in the film industry, anybody who had connections to somebody else that might help Charlie achieve his goal of being famous. It was like the original LinkedIn. He thought if he had another musician who had already made it, hear his music and vouch for him, that would be just the stepping stone he'd need to make it in his own career. And in a fateful turn of events, that's exactly what happened. Patricia Krenwinkel and another member, Ella Jo Bailey, were hitchhiking on the Strip when they were picked up by Dennis Wilson, drummer of the Beach Boys. At this same time, the band, the Beach Boys, were going through their own crisis. They had been popular once, but ticket sales were down, and their new songs didn't have the same sellability as they once did. They had released 19 albums in 7 years. Each one proved to be less in demand than the one before. During one tour, ticket sales were so low that they had canceled it halfway through, taking a loss of $500,000. Dennis had gone back to LA to waste his time with girls and drugs. Dennis Wilson had always been kind of a rule breaker and a rebel, and he was appreciated by his bandmates for the energy he brought to their live shows, but they didn't take him seriously with much anything else. He was immature, and although he was very talented at writing the musical element of a song, he wasn't very good with lyrics. He was renting a house on the west end of Sunset Boulevard on 3 acres, a rugged log cabin exterior with a luxurious mansion interior. It was the place to be for his old friends and new. He was a giving and generous person who loved meeting and talking with new people and enjoyed sharing the success he had in life with other people. He and his brothers Brian and Carl, also in the Beach Boys, came from a working class background, and they were born to a father that was physically abusive and used them when they got famous until they finally had enough. When he picked up Pat and Ella Jo on the road, he asked them did they want to come back to his house for some milk and cookies, and this sounds like code, but it wasn't. He actually really did give them milk and cookies, and then he asked them about their life, and they talked together. He was interested in new people. He was interested in these young bohemians who were taking over the entire city. It wasn't strange for him to pick up hitchhikers or travelers or strays and bring them back to his house and entertain them, give them food, give them drugs, talk to them, become friends. The girls told him about Charles Manson, their leader, their messiah, and the life they led and the freedom they had. When they got back to Charlie, they told them about their encounter with Dennis Wilson. And he was like, that's Dennis Wilson. It's like the drummer of the Beach Boys. And they were like, oh, yeah. And he was like, you need to bring me back there immediately. So he made the girls bring him and the entire family back to Dennis Wilson's house. But Dennis Wilson wasn't there. He'd had to leave to go to the recording studio. And he pulled his Ferrari into his driveway. He saw that the lights in his house inside were on. And as he parked, Charles Manson walked out of his house as if he was inviting him in to his own home. And when Dennis got out of the car, he thought that Charlie was going to hurt him or rob him. And he said, are you going to hurt me? And Charlie Manson said, do I look like I'm going to hurt you? And then he got down on his knees and kissed Dennis Wilson's feet. Charlie then walked Dennis into his own home, where everyone was waiting inside, making themselves comfortable and at home. Dennis recognized the 2 hitchhikers, Pat and Ella Jo, that he'd picked up earlier, and he was a little annoyed at first. He was like, what are you doing? Bringing all these people back to my house. But he eventually got over it when he saw that everybody was basically having a party. There was music, and most of the girls were topless. He was probably like, hey, I might get robbed tonight. These people might tie me up and take everything out of my house, but they seem to be having fun right now, so if you can't beat them, join them. The next day, they were still there, and the next day, and the next day, and Dennis didn't really seem interested in having them leave. He liked Charlie. He liked listening to him talk. He thought he was really spiritually elevated, very smart. He liked listening to Charlie talk about how our birth parents ruin us. I don't know if he knew about Dennis Wilson's past with his abusive father, or if he just used his intuition to kind of figure out that was a soft spot for Dennis, but that was exactly what Dennis wanted to hear. That was what spoke to him the most. Through Dennis Wilson, Charlie met other people in the music industry, and one of them was Greg Jacobson. Now, Greg Jacobson, if you remember the story from earlier about Terry Melcher and Dean Martin Jr. and how they were shooting the streetlights and the cops came and confiscated their gun, he was in the back seat with Dennis Wilson when that happened. But since then, he had become a talent scout for his friend Terry Melcher. When he met the family at Wilson's house, he was immediately pulled aside by Manson because Manson had been given the head up by Dennis Wilson that this was the man you wanted to know and get in with if you wanted to make it in the music industry because he's got Terry Melcher's ear, he's a talent scout, you need to get to know him. Manson knew that Greg was married, so he couldn't just throw any old girl his way. It had to be somebody special who would catch his attention, who would convince him to stray from his marriage. So he handpicked Ruth Ann Morehouse to give to Greg as a sort of present, and the two began an affair of some kind. Whenever Greg was around, they would hook up. Now, usually Charlie Manson would be adverse to having one of his girls form a relationship with another man, one that lasted more than one time at least. But her presence kept Greg coming around, and Manson really wanted Greg to keep coming around because he really, really wanted to be a famous rock star, and he knew that somebody like Greg would be able to help him do that. Now, Greg was not super impressed by what he heard when Manson played, but Dennis Wilson kept insisting, like, Charlie's the next big thing. He is going to be great. So he brought him to Brothers Records. It was a label started by the Beach Boys manager, Nick Grillo. The 5 band members were the major shareholders, and they had left Capitol Records to start their own label so that they could have a little bit more freedom over their music, and also so that they could recruit and bring in new talent to manage. So they were pretty much allowed to bring in whoever they wanted and record whoever they wanted. That was up to them. But since the tour fiasco, where they'd lost $500,000, they were being a little bit more careful with who they just started signing onto the label. They weren't really inclined at this point to take chances in any guy off the street, especially one that was constantly dirty, didn't wear shoes, and smelled. Around the Brothers Records offices, Charlie Manson got the name Pigpen, like the cartoon character from Charlie Brown who always has the flies flying around him. Well, for some reason, which I think I still don't understand to this day, let me know if you do, Dennis Wilson was gung-ho for Charlie, had his back, and he wouldn't let anybody tell him otherwise. He called him the Wizard, and he even told a British magazine called Rave that Charlie Manson was a genius, that he was probably going to be the next addition to Brothers Records, even before kind of getting that permission from his bandmates and his label. He quoted him in the magazine saying, "Fear is nothing but awareness. I was only frightened when I was a child because I did not understand fear, the dark, being lost, what was under the bed. It came from within." It's definitely a Manson quote. Definitely a talking in circles Manson quote. All the Beach Boys, besides Dennis, and the management group at the record label, they did not want Charlie involved with their label at all. They didn't think he was that talented. He gave them a bad vibe, and they actually hired a private investigator to look into his background, where they found out that he had been incarcerated several times. And they went to Dennis with this information like, "Oh, we got him, he's been in prison a bunch." And Dennis was surprised, but he was only surprised that Charlie had been telling the truth about being a jailbird, and being somebody who was a hardened criminal. Usually people lied about that to get clout or to get a reputation, but he was actually happy and pleased when he found out that Charlie had been telling the truth. So I'm going to end part 2 here. In part 3, we're going to pick up with the rest of the story, how Charlie eventually realizes that he's not going to be accepted into the music industry, how he turns violent, and how he directs a group of people to go on a murdering spree. Hope you guys enjoyed part 2. I'm going to get started working on editing this so that I can get it up for you by tomorrow, and then I will get part 3 out before I leave. Love you guys so much. Stay kind and stay beautiful. Bye.